それで何を狙う？
ノーはあなた様こそが天上天下の王と信じておりますれば、天下人となられるその日まで戦目としておそばに仕えとうございます。
はっ、よかろう。
ごめん遊ばせ。天下不武です、信長様。
Now all is yours, my lord. Heaven and earth under your rule.
I'm not just your average kid around the block.
Nouhime and Ranmaru serve as Nobunaga's closest allies in Sengoku Basara, both showing their devotion and loyalty in their own unique ways. These two are always shown to be by Nobunaga's side in a lot of Sengoku stories for a variety of reasons. The first of the two I want to look into is Nouhime. Nouhime was the daughter of Saito Dosan and was Nobunaga's wife. She was known for both her beautiful appearance as well as her intelligence. Unfortunately, like many women of history, there aren't a lot of historical records on Nouhime herself, meaning much of what we know about her life tends to be through the lens of the men who most affected it, her father and her husband. Saito Dosan was a powerful daimyo who had been slowly spreading his influence in the early to mid-1500s. This was mostly accomplished by taking advantage of different feuding clans and using their own conflicts to eliminate them. One clan that Saito fought regularly was the Oda clan, specifically Oda Nobuhide, the father of Nobunaga. Saito and Nobuhide, as gestures of good faith and as a means of gaining political favor with one another, wed their children, Nouhime and Nobunaga. Nobunaga was, like many warlords of the time, a man who had a fair number of concubines alongside his wife. This fact is important to bring up with Nouhime as it's believed that there wasn't much love shared between the two. There are records that indicate that Nobunaga certainly respected Nouhime and praised her for her intellect. However, his first son, Nobutada, was actually born from his concubine Kitsuno, who is often noted as being the woman Nobunaga was actually in love with. A lot of the stories of Nouhime and Nobunaga's marriage come from Edo tales rather than hard facts, similar to a lot of what is known about Yukimura. Thus, despite Nouhime being a political marriage, she is often the one who is paired with Nobunaga in games and other media. Additionally, the most common imagery of Nouhime is that of a butterfly, as one of the characters of her proper name, Kicho, means butterfly. While Saito was a powerful man, her mother, Omi no Kada, potentially connects her to another general in Nobunaga's army, Mitsuhide Akachi. You see, Omi no Kada was the daughter of Mitsusugu Akachi, who was Mitsuhide's grandfather, meaning the two would have been cousins. However, the Akachi family tree, especially as it pertains to Mitsuhide, is something that's still debated amongst scholars today, so, while fiction highlights this familial bond, it isn't something that's completely supported by primary evidence. In Sengoku Basara, she is portrayed as eternally devoted to Nobunaga. She is shown as being neither sadistic nor lost in depression, two traits often assigned to her in other stories, and, instead, Nouhime's character is one who doesn't like warfare, but loves her husband and his ambitions more. Nouhime's fighting style is one that mixes gunplay and martial arts. In the first two games, she's the only character who technically has an endless normal art combo, as it's just her firing her guns until the player stops or she's hit. She can also move while attacking, which helps a lot with crowd control. This is probably her most versatile attack. It deals a good amount of damage on its own, and her element, fire, increases damage dealt over time. As for her skills, a lot of them focus on keeping enemies at a distance and aren't really designed to be utilized in a traditional combo, which makes sense given the nature of her normal art. Additionally, Nouhime is a glass cannon, which means keeping opponents away from you is a high priority. The first of her skills, Black Lizard, has her kick her opponents away. It's simple in animation and function, but that simplicity makes it very effective. It's fast, and it leaves Nouhime in a good spot to follow up with her guns. Leap of the Sweetfish has her launch her enemies upward with a rifle. This attack is meant to be a juggle, and sometimes you can connect with it, though the bosses, even if they're on the lighter end, have different physics than normal enemies, meaning it's hard to connect when using it against them. Given that Nouhime is mostly going to be gunning down her opponents, this attack isn't too helpful on lower difficulties, but it can be an effective way to open up enemies on hard mode. Roar of Orochi has her pull out a Gatling gun and repeatedly fire it at enemies. The button can be pressed multiple times to increase the number of hits. Nouhime remains stationary during this attack, but is able to rotate, allowing you to cover your surroundings. This attack does a good job of keeping enemies at bay, and, unlike her normal art, is able to stagger any enemies that are attacked by it, allowing you to keep pressure on them without risking them countering. Awakening of the Butterfly has Nouhime perform a martial arts combo. The full sequence is activated by pressing the triangle button multiple times, meaning you can interrupt it and resume her normal art combo at specific intervals, though it isn't as linked as Nobunaga's Distant Thunder. The attack is okay and, in a lot of ways, feels like what most characters have as their normal art combo. In fact, her unique item in Sengoku Basara 2 actually does make it her normal art combo. I'll get more into this later, but I'm sure if she did have an HD moveset that probably would have become a permanent change. Passing of the Dragonfly changes the screen, making Nouhime into a rail shooter. She is able to strafe around the battlefield wherever she wants, but the camera is locked to her back. When attacking in this state, Nouhime fires in 2-shot intervals, which can be repeated. This state lasts until the player deactivates it or until Nouhime is hit, similar to how her normal art combo functions. This is, without a doubt, her most broken attack. While it has some limitations, such as not being able to block and each individual bullet dealing less damage than her normal art combo, it more than makes up for it in the fact that, like Roar of Orochi, all attacks stagger enemies. However, unlike that skill, Nouhime still has a full range of movement, meaning you can pin enemies against the wall and, since there's no time limit, they can't escape. This is a no-brainer skill to have for her in both games she appears in, and while it's really good in the second game, it is stupid easy to exploit in the first. I'd go so far as to say passing of the Dragonfly is the best skill any character has in the first game. Allow me to demonstrate via this footage of me defeating Tadakatsu, the strongest enemy in the first game, on hard with her lowest tier weapon and no items equipped. This fight is hard enough with the best weapons on the highest level in the first game, so trust me when I say, this is overpowered. Her last skill in the first game is Dance of the Skylark, in which she furiously fires her guns all around her, scattering enemies in all directions. Like her other close-range martial arts skills, this is primarily designed to keep crowds off you. Her Basara skill has her call down a laser, attacking foes all around her, knocking them all away. As a high damage attack, it's lacking, but, like her other skills, it still fits into her larger toolset of keeping enemies at bay. I'm going to go ahead and include her Sengoku Basara 2 skill in this section as she doesn't change too much between the games, and it'll be easier to just talk about her in general afterward. The new skill she gets in Sengoku Basara 2 is Sea God's Squall, which has her fire a blast underground, sending a shockwave ahead of her that explodes in front of enemies. Again, there isn't much to note about this attack, and, as redundant as it sounds, it's mainly meant to keep enemies away. Though, unlike her other skills, it's really only applicable for enemies who are already far away from you, so I don't know why you'd necessarily prioritize it over her other skills that cover long range and are faster on startup. Nouhime is incredibly good, and doesn't struggle with too many things. Due to the nature of her moveset, she functions very well right from the start, and thus didn't need to be refined too much between the first two games. I will say that her martial arts skills feel underutilized in comparison to her other skills. Because they all essentially function as keep-away tools, there isn't too much incentive to choose one over the other. Additionally, Nouhime has a fast run, so unless you're hellbent on keeping your ground, it's typically best to just create distance by running away from enemies and firing at them from a distance. Despite her being a fun character, she admittedly isn't as flashy as some of the other cast, so you really have to be into gunner characters to get the most enjoyment out of her. Ranmaru Mori was a retainer of Nobunaga Oda. The Mori clan had many men who served under Nobunaga, but Ranmaru is remembered for his large reward of 50,000 koku, which was unfathomably rich for the time, and for staying by Nobunaga's side at Honnoji, dying with his lord. It was through his family's efforts that Nobunaga was able to commit seppuku, and afterward, they burned down the temple, perishing with him. Ranmaru's loyalty and devotion to Nobunaga are constants in his appearances. Often this devotion is that of a soldier fulfilling the will of his master, but in Sengoku Basara, it's presented in a rather unique way. Here, Ranmaru's childish nature is his most defining trait, emphasizing that he was considerably young amongst Nobunaga's troops. From his lightning-fast movements, his outfit, and the fact that he shares Nobunaga's nod to be like his hero, the games present him as a kid trying to live up to the image and expectations of his idol. This idea heavily deviates from the kind of relationship Edo's stories depicted them having, and his Wakushudo visual, which ultimately influenced many of Ranmaru's modern appearances in other stories. Ranmaru's appearances in other media are often effeminized or gender swapped entirely because of said Edo stories, and so this series stands out drastically for not using that trope. I would actually argue that having Ranmaru idolize Nobunaga through a childish lens helps to set this version apart from other depictions in a good way, as it gives him a little more character than he otherwise has, where his main reason for being in other stories is because of what he did at Honnoji, often leaving him to feel somewhat superfluous. Despite using a bow and arrow, Ranmaru's normal art combo acts a lot like most characters, unleashing a close-range attack chain. It's relatively fast and hits multiple times per attack, but has a deceptively short range. Ranmaru's skills are a mix of close-range combos and long-range attacks that are more expected of a bow user. Summer Rain has Ranmaru shoot arrows in a straight line. Each time you press the triangle button, he fires one arrow. In Sengoku Basara 2, the button can be held down to charge the arrow. It isn't that beneficial both from a combo and basic attack perspective, as the arrows are fired rather slowly and they're very small, so they don't do a good job of keeping enemies at bay. Ranmaru, like Nouhime, has low health, but given his speed and the fact that a lot of his attacks operate in more of a combo-heavy way, there isn't much of a need to keep enemies away from you. Cloudburst has Ranmaru dash toward the enemy and launch them upward. He then follows this up by firing arrows at them. This is his go-to combo ender, and all things considered, it isn't too bad. I will say it feels like it should go on longer, and even when pressing the button multiple times, it isn't extended that long. Heavy Thunder has Ranmaru shoot an arrow into the sky to call down a bolt of lightning in front of him. This attack deals good damage, but is hard to utilize because of the startup. Often, any tough enemy you may need to use this on is probably going to be long gone from the position the lightning comes down on by the time it hits. Though it's perfect for fighting the giant mechs as they are very large and move slow enough that it's practically impossible to miss. Hurricane Chaser has Ranmaru load 5 large arrows that act like homing missiles. This is another high damaging attack and is easier to use than Heavy Thunder, mostly due to the fact that the arrows track, which makes up for its long startup. Meteor Shower, his final skill in the first game, has Ranmaru jump into the air and rain down a volley of arrows on enemies. If the button is pressed repeatedly, the attack lasts longer. This is his best skill in the first game as it deals decent damage, is easy to aim, and gets Ranmaru out of harm's way. It isn't super effective against bosses, but that's where his Basara skill comes in. His Basara skill has him shoot an arrow upward that then proceeds to rain down arrows all around him. It's one of the few Basara skills in the first game that does good damage on bosses and easily shreds through their health, which it similarly does with mech enemies. I will say that Ranmaru's overall stunted strength does prevent him from one-shotting bosses, even on easy, and the arrow's hitboxes can sometimes knock them out of it, but overall it definitely ranks up there as one of the best Basara skills for single targets. Ranmaru gets 2 new skills in Sengoku Basara 2, Nichikage and Purple Bolt. Nichikage has Ranmaru charge forward, dealing damage to any enemy in his way. I guess an easy comparison for this attack is that of the spin dash from Sonic, which is a lot more awkward in the context of a character action game than you'd think. It goes pretty far, but shifts Ranmaru's momentum so drastically that it's hard to use as either a movement option or as an attack. Purple Bolt has Ranmaru spin around before firing an arrow. This arrow ricochets off of walls and is capable of hitting multiple enemies multiple times. Additionally, Ranmaru can fire multiple arrows with this attack, having 2 to 3 arrows out at any given moment bouncing between enemies. This is his best skill between the 2 games and allows Ranmaru to rack up combos very easily. With the right setup of combo boosting skills and weapons, Ranmaru can easily hit Basara and Fever states, allowing you to earn money more easily. It also allows for a small amount of DPS against bosses, but it's not as beneficial as his Basara skill in that context. Ranmaru's move list, overall, doesn't really mesh well. I like that, in theory, he is the balance between Nobunaga's aggressive pressure and Nohime's ranged attacks, but it feels like none of his skills are capable of filling either role, even in a jack-of-all-trades kind of way. As such, it feels awkward to use any of Ranmaru's skills as they halt the momentum of his combo. However, his normal art isn't particularly strong either. Ranmaru's Basara skill is really good, and that shouldn't be understated, but as a full package, he's on the weaker end of characters both in terms of stats and combat in general. The thing is, both he and Nouhime don't appear again after Sengoku Basara 2. They are technically in the PSP games, but those battle systems are so radically different from any other game that it doesn't really demonstrate their evolution well, as they're mostly downgrades to their already small move lists. Therefore, a lot of the issues these two have never had a chance to be ironed out. So, why did these two just up and vanish from the games? Well, from 2 onward, the games have a weird habit of dropping and adding characters without much logic. 3 has the benefit of story, in theory, but when you see anachronistic officers around during Sekigahara, it rings a little hollow that it's for plot reasons, especially when many of them were added back in with the expansion. Despite that fact, it seems as though Ranmaru and Nouhime were initially removed for said plot reasons. After all, Nobunaga is supposed to be dead, so it only makes sense that Nouhime and Ranmaru wouldn't be too active. But I think a bigger reason these two were removed was due to conflict with other characters. Ranmaru, it seems, has largely been replaced with Tsuruhime, and Nouhime has been replaced with
今ここで我らを雇いたいと無理だな次の戦場が我らを呼んでいる
Magoichi, whom I have very normal feelings about. But what's even odder is as characters are added, removed, and added back in for future entries, Nouhime and Ranmaru, among a handful of others, are largely neglected and, all things considered, don't play as one-to-one as their replacements. I can't get into too much detail as, again, Tsuruhime and my wife don't debut until the 3rd game, but the short version is that Ranmaru's arrows are close range while Tsuruhime's are more long range. There is a fair bit more similarities between the gunslingers, but even then, Nouhime had a lot of gun kata in her moveset and was more than capable of mixing in martial arts. Unfortunately, unless there's a Sengoku Basara 5, there isn't going to be too many answers as to why they were removed and, furthermore, why they didn't return in 4. Nouhime and Ranmaru, overall, are fairly simple characters. Given that they never had an HD update to their movesets, they're limited in a lot of the things they can do. Between the two, Nouhime is undeniably more powerful due to how her mechanics work. As for Ranmaru, while he's a lot of fun, I don't find him particularly good, and a lot of his skills are functional at best, but never stand out enough that I feel I can incorporate them well. You'll find a lot of the characters who become permanently dropped after Basara 2 are going to be on the simple end of character complexity, meaning these two are easy to pick up and even easier to master.
Oh, just great. A blonde with an attitude. Yuck!
来るがいい私は決して負けないあの方は太陽私は月春日舞